Hello, and welcome to my talk on false Apollos and festoons, which I've entitled On the Edge, Archon, Allancastria, and Zerynthia in Eastern Europe. And my name is Michael de Courcy Williams, and I'm an entomologist, and I live in northeast Greece, here in the region of Evros. And I want to start my presentation with a quick view of species diversity and geographic range of them and illustrate some of the totally fascinating ecology and ecosystem linkages of this group of butterflies, and end with an illustration of the kind of threats that they face with a real world example. Now, the first thing we can say about these is that the remarkable color patterns make these some of our most striking and distinctive butterflies. And these include festoons of the genera Zerynthia and Allancastria in the tribe Zerynthini, and the false Apollos of the genus Archon in another tribe, the Leuendorfini. And to illustrate that, I have some pictures here. On the left-hand side, you can see the southern festoon, Zerynthia polysina, and in the middle, a male of the eastern festoon, Allancastria sericii. Both those species are in the tribe Zerynthini. And on the right-hand side, a female of the false Apollo, Archon apollinus, from northeast Greece, and this one is in the tribe Leuendorfini. And these genera all have species with a very distinctive European distribution, and that makes them precious elements of our fauna. Now, the first thing I want to say is that all of these are restricted to the Western Palearctic region. Zerynthia occurs in Central and Southern Europe, Turkey, and in Northwest Africa. Allancastria occurs in the Southern Balkans, into Turkey, and northwards to the Caucasus, and south to Cyprus and the Middle East. And Archon occurs in Southeast Europe, in the Northeast Greece mainland, which is where I'm giving this presentation from, as well as the Aegean Islands, Turkey, and the coastal area of the Middle East, as well as in northwestern Iran. And the second thing I want to illustrate is that each of these genera have actually a very small number of species. So Zerynthia has 4 species, one of which is in northwest Africa. Allancastria has 5 species, one of which is restricted to parts of Iran. And lastly, Archon, the false Apollo, has only, as we currently recognize it, has only 3 species, 2 of which are restricted to southeast Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. And it's useful to look at how this small group of genera and species are related. And to do this, I'm illustrating this with a phylogenetic tree based on a sequence analysis of the so-called barcode gene, cytochrome oxidase subunit 1, COI or CO1. And this tree is based on the one that is presented in von Stetten and Bozzano in their book of 2021 in the series Guide to the Butterflies of the Palearctic Region, a truly incredible series produced by Omnes Artis in Italy. And this reflects their work on a simplified version of the neighbor joining tree from their work. And if you look on the left-hand side of it, you can see that there are 2 main groups, which are, and the third group, which is Parnassus itself, the Apollos, we're not considering today because there are some difficulties in that. But the remaining 2 form quite distinct groups that are defined on morphology and the fact that all of these species feed on plants of the family Aristolochiaceae. And if you look at the top part of that, the Leuendorfini comprises the false Apollos and another genus, Leuendorfia, which occurs in the eastern Palearctic. And Leuendorfia is the only one that feeds on genera other than Aristolochia. In this case, it feeds on Azarum and Saruma, but it's restricted to the eastern Palearctic, so it's not in our region. Now, in the central and bottom part of this, you can see that this is the group of Zerynthini, and it comprises Zerynthia, Allancastria, as well as 2 further genera, including Bhutanitis, which includes really iconic species such as the Bhutan glory and other so-called 3-tailed swallowtails. And Sericines itself is another iconic species with a long-tailed, monotypic species in that genus, with a long-tailed one called the dragon's swallowtail. Now, both those are central, they occur in central and eastern Palearctic, so they fall outside our area of concern. And now it's useful to kind of drill into these relationships a little bit more and draw out some conclusions that we can make. So starting with the false Apollo group, Archon, illustrated here by a male of Archon apollinus from northeast Greece. We can see that two of these species are local endemics in southwest Turkey and Iran. And the third one, Archon apollinus, in this work seems to split into two quite clear groups. And these are separated by a difference of about 2.7%, which would really indicate that they are well-defined separate species, even though their morphology might not reflect that. And the contrast here really is between the coastal zone of the Middle East with Greece and western and southern Turkey. So the conclusion we can make here is that there's definitely a need for further work to actually resolve the status of these species that form isolation populations, and there's more than just the two indicated there, in central and northern Turkey, as well as in the coastal region of the Middle East at southern Syria. And moving on to Allancastria here illustrated by the eastern festoon, we can see they too form local regional endemics, one in the island of Crete and the other in Iran. And two more species occur in regionally restricted areas of northern Turkey and into the Caucasus and into the Middle East. Whereas the eastern festoon itself, Allancastria sericea, occurs across parts of the Balkans, western Turkey, and Middle East. And here we can conclude that this group of species are well defined, but there is further work needed to define the status of some of the local populations of eastern festoon Allancastria sericea, which have been used based on morphology to describe subspecies. And we need to see across its restricted geographic range how valid some of these are. And then finally on to Zerynthia here, illustrated by the common southern festoon, Zerynthia polysina. We can see that one of these species is regionally restricted to Northwest Africa, and the two others are restricted to parts of Iberia and southwest France, and also in Italy, south of the Po River. So they are also showing regional local endemics. And Zerynthia polysina itself is distributed across central and southern Eastern Europe onto southwest Russia. And here we can conclude that this group also comprises well-defined species with a number of local or regional endemics, but some further work is needed to define the status of local populations of Zerynthia polysina. Here I'm thinking particularly of this contrast between the population in southwest France to the one that occurs in central and southern East Europe. And just to summarize the species diversity, we can say that these species are all very distinctive and very characteristic, and they contain a small total number of species, many of which are endemic either at the regional or indeed local level. But nevertheless, all have very restricted global populations. And that makes them a particular responsibility to Europe and the Middle East. But there's also a need to use some kind of modern techniques, including total mitochondrial DNA sequencing analysis with NGS, next generation sequencing, to look at a multi-locus approach to resolve some of the taxon status of these local endemics. And moving on to the second part of my talk, I want to illustrate a little bit about the ecology, in particular the food plants. And all the species that we're talking about today, the festoons and the false Apollos, feed on species of the plant genus Aristolochia. And this is likely to be the ancestral food plant of the whole family, Papilionidae. Now, obviously, Papilionidae is a large family and it shows many food plant shifts. And Papilionidae, the swallowtails, are the only butterflies to use plants of the family Aristolochiaceae. Otherwise, I only know of a family of Corevtidae, metalmark moths, which are leaf miners in Aristolochia. And another interesting aspect of this is that this food plant is shared between the cold-adapted Parnassiinae, which we're talking about today, and some of the tropical Triodini. And these Triodini include really iconic genera such as Trogonoptera, for example, the Rajabrooks birdwings, as well as the massive Ornithoptera species of Southeast Asia, and also Troides and other genera. And it's you should know that some of these genera also show food plant fish shifts, so they don't all feed on Aristolochia. Now, what on earth is the genus Aristolochia? Well, these flowers show a distinctive tubular or trumpet shape, and they have a very extraordinary basal chamber, enclosed chamber called the utricle, which is where pollination actually occurs. And this involves a little bit of magic, which I will describe later. And to illustrate this, I want to show some of the appearance of Aristolochia and these flowers. With, on the left-hand side, Aristolochia rotunda. Next along is a species with a very range of morphology of flower shapes, and it's in the Aristolochia pallida complex. And this one is typically the Greek clade. But here you can see the trumpet shape and this extraordinary basal swelling, the utricle, which is where pollination occurs. The next one along, Aristolochia hirta, has this extraordinary flower entrance, and the flower itself is kind of saxophone shape, also with this basal chamber. And on the right-hand side, you can see the more uniform colored appearance of Aristolochia clematitis. But clearly visible here is also this basal chamber where pollination occurs. And now this family has an estimated origin around 100 million years ago, which makes it some of the oldest flowering plants known. And as I alluded to, it's distributed nearly worldwide across temperate and tropical regions. And like many plants, it's a master of chemistry. And the most well known is aristolochic acid, which is a carcinogen and a slow acting renal toxin, extraordinary form of defense. But another really amazing aspect of this plant is its pollination, which is called kleptomyophily. And we can think of this as betrayed thieves. So the thieves refers to klepto, and myophily indicates that these are flowers that are pollinated by flies in particular. And this involves a really extraordinary and complex chemistry involving scent mimicry, but not smells and scents that you or I can detect from the flowers, but very particular mimicry of alarm pheromones of other insects that have been attacked by larger predators, other insects or spiders. And the plant uses these to attract and trap specific fly species in this basal chamber. And these have got to be very small species because the entrance pore to this chamber is of the diameter of about 1 millimeter. And these plants attract flies across a wide spectrum of the phylogeny of flies, including Phoridae, scuttleflies, Chloropodidae, grass flies, and Ceratopogonidae, which are midges. Now, it doesn't just attract all of these flies, but only very specific species from these very wide range of group of species. And all these flies are united by the fact that they have this ecology where they feed on insects that have been killed, recently killed by other predators. So essentially, these are kleptoparasitic on insect carrion, extraordinary. And this complex chemistry has only been resolved recently and described, and includes quite a number of very different chemicals and alarm pheromones that are used. For example, oligosulfides have been detected in a species of Aristolochia microstoma that occurs in southern Greece, and a range of aliphatic esters and hydrocarbons have been implicated in this kind of attraction mechanism in another species of Aristolochia rotunda, which also occurs in Greece. And we can see that this is actually a unique pollination mechanism in plants within the Aristolochiaceae. It's unique and basically has two quite novel aspects to it. One is that the flies are interested in feeding for themselves, not gathering food for their offspring, the brood of commonly in bees. And the second thing is that it uses this extraordinary mimicry of the pheromones produced by freshly killed insects. Truly extraordinary. Now, to kind of summarize that overall ecology, we can see that the butterflies have an extensive ecological network, and that includes aspects of food plant distribution and food plant specificity. And for example, false Apollo occurs in clearings in the oak forest, and its flight season is early in the year before oak trees have fully formed into leaves and closed off the canopy. And this gives them a chance to disperse to find other areas that have their food plant. And certainly involves an interaction with alternative food plants to allow them to disperse properly. And also there are interactions with other insects. For example, I've just talked about the pollinators. And the food plants themselves have this incredibly instinctive chemistry. They're poisonous. I mentioned aristolochic acid, but we're discovering that they also secrete pheromones that mimic the kind of smells of stink bugs have to deter herbivores. And then they have this unique pollination mechanism, including alarm pheromones of freshly killed insects. Now, I just want to end the presentation with an example of the kind of threats they have to face, and I'm going to use Archon apollinus, the false Apollo, and fire. And false Apollo is a good species to use here because it is very restricted globally and even locally within its range. It doesn't occur everywhere. And it probably is actually a mosaic of very distinct species over its range. And each one of these will have particular habitat requirements and indeed flight times. And its primary food plant is the Aristolochia hirta group and possibly Aristolochia pallida complex, but it certainly can use alternative food plants, plants that are much more widely distributed than the butterfly is itself. Now, in 2023, we had a truly enormous fire in Evros, and the area burnt is of the order of 92,000 hectares. 923 square kilometers were burnt over a protracted period from late August to early September. And all the false Apollo sites were burnt, and the fire has had a huge impact on the landscape and the wildlife here. And just to illustrate that, this is a view from my house of the fire just prior to when we had the whole village had to evacuate one night because of the danger the fire posed. And secondly, is to show the kind of total destruction from intense fires like this. And as I mentioned, all the sites that the false Apollo occurs in on this part of mainland Greece were burnt over. And to illustrate that, there's a picture on the left, which is a clearing full of food plants and all sorts of nectar sources within the oak forest, which is an absolute paradise for false Apollo. And the picture on the right is looking into the very same clearing, showing the level of burn that the site suffered, as well as heavy traffic from vehicles that were trying to contain and put out the fire. So the outlook looked extraordinarily pessimistic. And really the question was, is this an extinction event for false Apollo? And did Archon apollinus false Apollo recover? Well, in the spring of 2024, this year, we saw very strong populations at all of the key sites that I know about. And we can attribute this to a number of characteristics. The butterfly pupates below ground, and it's there from June onwards, so well ahead of the time of the fire, it's underground. The food plant itself is a geophyte. The bulb or corm is deep underground, 20 or more centimeters. And so it is protected from the fire. And it already had set seed and was beginning to senesce in July, long before the fire occurred. And we also saw that there were many nectar sources abundant in the spring, and these are themselves many geophytes. And festoons themselves were present, but strongly noticeably, in much lower populations. And to illustrate that, I have some pictures of false Apollo feeding on a flower stalk of grape Hyacinth muscari, which is a geophyte, and it's very characteristic to see the false Apollo feeding in a spiral on the open flowers of the flower stalk of grape hyacinth. In the middle, we see a female of eastern festoon on the flowers of asphodelus, which itself is a geophyte, and on the right-hand side, a mating pair of southern festoon to kind of indicate resilience and hope. So we can see that these are resilient species. They were able to survive this, and there's great hope for future recovery. So just to kind of summarize the whole presentation, we can see that the false Apollo festoons are species with very restricted global distributions, making them a particular responsibility to us in Europe and in the Middle East. And there is a need to resolve some of the status of some of the species, particularly the local endemics, and probably the most useful tool here is a multi-locusing sequencing analysis. And that their ecology involves a rich network of interactions involving degrees of site and food plant specificity as well as an interaction with plant chemistry and the other insects through the pollination mechanism the plant use. And all of these face threats of extinction based on human activities, in particular climate change and fire. But to illustrate a ray of hope, I've got two pictures here. One is an opened nest of false Apollo caterpillars, young stage caterpillars on Aristolochia, and they enclose themselves with silk in the leaves in the early stages. And I think they're the only species to do this. And on the right hand side, we can see a false Apollo butterfly looking very tattered, but clearly resistant to the effects of the fires. So, although they are resilient, they badly need protection. And just to finalize my presentation, I want to uh, say that I hope I've done justice to these incredibly amazing butterflies, and thank you for listening. And really, with a special thanks to my family, Menya and Alkis, for supporting me in these works. And I want to mention Matt Berry of Greenwing Wildlife Holidays, who was instrumental in setting me off on this path of discovery of false Apollos and festoons, and to the many people who have come with Greenwings Wildlife Holidays to see these butterflies and to see wild Erebros. And also, lastly, to the Swallowtail and Birdwing Butterfly Trust for inviting me to make this presentation. So thank you very much.